Hi class, this is week 3 in your history of America from 1900 to the present time. And today in this video I'm just going to summarize for you some of the reading that you did last week, and we'll talk a little bit about imperialism and America as an empire. So we're starting right at America at 1900. And this is based on your reading in American Yawp. And you may recognize this photograph. It was in your online textbook. And what I want to talk about is what are the major developments, transformations happening in America by 1900. So obviously, we don't just open up onto the year 1900 with everything changing and everything different than it was before. So things have been developing and changing in America for decades now. But we are focusing primarily on the turn of the century, 1900 to the present time. So that's what I will be talking about. But I want you to keep in mind that things start to happen before this time period. You've seen in the United States, there's been some economic advances, technological innovation, social and cultural evolution, and demographic changes. And you all have written about this in your summary posts. You've read about that this week. If you have any questions about any of these things that I'm talking about, I want you to go back to your text and kind of reread that portion. I don't want this video to turn into a very lengthy lecture. Here's just some of the things that you are witnessing at this time: the rise of the cities, evolution of American immigration, creation of great concentration of wealth, transformation of American labor, emergence of the middle class, and so on. And if you need to pause this video to read through some of these, you certainly can. The main topics that I want you to pay more attention to as you're reading: the idea of industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and imperialism. So these are really the 4 key terms, the 4 key things that are happening that I want you to keep kind of at the forefront of your head and in your mind as you're reading. Now, imperialism, I think it's always good to start with definitions so that we know exactly what we're talking about, is the extension of a nation's authority by territorial acquisition or by the establishment of economic and political dominance over other nations. So when we're talking about imperialism in this class, or when you're reading about it in the text, this is the kind of working definition that I want you to use and to think about. So please feel free, if you need to take notes as we're going through, you can pause the video at any time so that you have time to write this down. So continuing to expand a little bit more on the definition of imperialism: the process whereby the dominant politico-economic interests of one nation expropriate for their own enrichment the land, labor, raw materials, and markets of another people. So, in other words, the practice of a larger country or government growing stronger by taking over poorer or weaker countries that have important resources. So since you've done the readings, you probably know what we're talking about in terms of the territories: Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, and so we get into, just following along with the text, this splendid little war, as the Spanish-American War has been called. And there's lots of causes we could get into, lots of reasons why this war happened. I want you to read for yourself and come to your own conclusions. I'm not going to read all of these notes here in the PowerPoint. Just want this here for you if you need it. So again, pause the video if you want to read the specific details. This is going to be just a very brief overview to recap On February 15th, 1898, the American battleship the Maine was exploded in Havana Harbor off of Cuba, and most likely it was an accident. This killed nearly 270 Americans, and the press escalated the incident, blaming Spain for the explosion and demanding retribution. And so this became a very popular call in the United States, in the public, mostly because of what was happening in the press. And so now we're looking at the influence that the media has on the way that people perceive events and perceive what's happening in the world. So the turn of the century leading up to the 1900s, we're really starting to see film come into play, pictures and newspapers. Of course, newspapers have always been around, but this time when now people can see pictures, newspapers are widely circulated. So here's a clip from the New York Journal, and you can read for yourself what was written at the time. Here's another clip from the New York Times. So it's important that you look at these firsthand, these kind of primary accounts, to see what was being talked about, what the media was portraying about this incident. Another way to kind of get at maybe public opinion or the way that the public was being influenced to think, you could look at cartoons and different displays in the newspaper. And this was in the Boston Globe in May of 1898. And you can pick this apart and look at what's happening, who's serving up to Uncle Sam these cuts. It looks like choice cuts of meat in the form of a Cuba steak and a Puerto Rico pig and the Sandwich Islands and the Philippines. There's a lot of detail in there for you to explore. And Uncle Sam is saying, well, I hardly know which to take first. These are some really interesting things to look at. So please look at these in your chapter as you're reading through. Why did America embark on imperial endeavors? These are some questions that you had in your comments. You could go back to 1893 and look at America having undergone an economic depression. And this increased the belief that America needed a more aggressive foreign policy to stimulate American exports. So there's a need to open up new markets so that we can get these goods to market. And also, if America is in the business of increased industrialization, producing more goods, they're also going to need the resources. And where will we find the resources to keep production? Nationalism became an effective solve for the fears of economic and ethnic disunity that plagued America. So you already know from last week there's an increased immigration, there's labor unrest from what's happening by the treatment of labor in these factories. So nationalism can kind of serve as a way to alleviate some of the fears for changes that are happening in society. So those are just maybe two reasons for America embarking on these imperial endeavors. Of course, you may come to your own conclusions and you may see other reasons, and I'd love to hear those. Again, just keeping in mind some of the facts of the era, some things we can look at. The America late 19th century, early 20th century, the imperialist history goes back before this time, but we're focusing on the annexation of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War in 1898, and an intervention in Mexico. There are consequences of the Spanish-American War, and this number one consequence is that America emerges as a world power. And what does that mean? How will Americans deal with this? How will leadership deal with this? How will the military deal with this? There's lots of questions that come out of this Spanish-American War. And again, pause your video if you'd like to read this and take some notes. these new territories that we spoke about, the Hawaii, Cuba, Philippines, intervening in Mexico, what's going to happen if America is expanding and it's increasing its territory? Will these people be citizens or subjects? Will we be a republic or an empire? So with the victory over Spain, there's a decision to be made. America is emerging as a world power, but this sparks serious debate in the United States about the relationship between political democracy, race, and citizenship. How will these new territories be governed? And this is a huge, huge question. And you can see from your reading last week how proponents of empire, such as Senator Beveridge, really argued for and believed in the domination of the whites over the non-white people, the kind of less civilized, as he would put it, the quote-unquote savages of the world. This was part of the progress of civilization. And you can see in that language that he uses that really comes through very strongly. Again, here is another cartoon. You may need to pause it and maybe zoom in. It's just kind of poking fun of kind of the growth, the power, as Uncle Sam starts in as a little baby at the beginning in the Revolutionary era, and then he grows in size till he's kind of this large, obese, fat man who, who are these hands reaching out for help? Are they reaching out for help, or is Uncle Sam imposing his will on others? So again, spend some time looking at these cartoons. They're very informative. They give you some great insight into these imperialist attitudes, or these anti-imperialist attitudes, whatever they may be. Here's a little slide breaking down industrialization for you. Here's one on law. I'm just going to go through these quickly because you can pause these at any point that you want to stop and look at these. Here's a little bit about the railroads. So keep in mind, these aren't natural creations. This isn't something that just that human beings kind of stumbled upon and decided to use. These are made by people, made by industry, and there's vast capital that needs to be invested into these railroads. And Lincoln's Republican Party dominated government, and he passed a legislation granting vast subsidies for these railroads to be built. So you can read a little bit about that. Their huge expenditures spurred countless industries and attracted droves of laborers, and this is all from last week, as you read. Here's some information on the railroads. This is for your own interest. If it's been piqued on and you want to look at certain points of interest, then certainly pause it here and take notes for yourself. We're also talking about geography. So the railroad is a technological innovation, but it's also changing the geography in the sense that it's pulling things together in a way that they've never been able to communicate or to work with each other before. So the continent is vast, and it takes a lot of energy to fuel this industrial revolution. So we have water power, coal, iron, and eventually oil. The lands for agriculture, for producing grain, and for the cattle. How are they going to get their goods and trade and move along all of this new industry that's emerging? And of course, the railroads pull it together, but geography plays a large role in our history as well. How does this all tie to imperialism? How do the railroads, the expansion, the connections within in our kind of domestic front, how do they tie to us moving out into the wider world? Really think about how imperialism has at its core a desire for markets, for American goods, and those goods were increasingly manufactured by immigrant labor. So I'm going to stop it here. I'm up against the 15-minute mark, and this is just meant to be a brief summary so you can kind of generate some new ideas about the reading that you already did, or if you haven't read it, you can begin to take some notes. Thanks.